Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode we explore the creation of one of the world's most famous children's stories in Goodbye, Christopher Robin. Traumatised by what he saw while fighting in World War I, A. Milne, played by Domhnall Gleeson, is determined to write an anti-war book. Moving from London to near Ashdown Forest in Surrey against the wish of his wife Daphne, played by Margot Robbie, A. begins to spend more time playing with his son Christopher Robin, nicknamed Billy Moon, played by Will Tilson and later Alex Lawther, which inspires the creation of Winnie the Pooh and the 100 Acre Wood. But as A.A.'s creation becomes a global sensation, his decision to use Christopher's name in the book results in him becoming famous, and his son endures the cost of the book's success. We're compulsively drawn towards stories, be it books, theatre, film, and I think the reason that is because you can control the narrative. You can ascribe meaning and purpose to events, unlike real life, which is defiantly random, sometimes cruelly so. But in stories, you can shape and mould it and explore your own fears and desires. And certainly I think that those things can really resonate with people, so much so that some stories have become cultural touchstones for whole generations, such as the likes of Winnie the Pooh, for example. But if we're drawn towards stories, then we're also drawn towards stories about stories. And we like to peek behind the curtain and look at the creative process and see how the creators and their own instincts shaped what we know and love. And certainly Goodbye, Christopher Robin compares to the likes of Finding Neverland or Saving Mr. Banks. But unlike those movies, Goodbye, Christopher Robin certainly strays into difficult territory, and I think if you're a fan of those beloved books, learning about the history behind them might be somewhat eye-opening. Unlike the latter film, this isn't a Disney movie, and certainly it doesn't really avoid the somewhat uncomfortable edges of the story behind a beloved creation. When we first meet A. Milne at the beginning of the movie, he's deeply traumatised by his experience in World War I. What he saw out on the battlefield horrified him to his very core, and he's experiencing recurring flashbacks, and certainly his symptoms would be what we would now refer to as PTSD, in that loud noises remind him of explosions and gunfire, and he's persistently dogged by the sound of buzzing flies which were surrounding the corpses that he saw. Milne is so determined that he shirks the comedic plays that he's been writing to pursue an anti-war book. And what the film tries to do is that it tries to connect what Milne is feeling at this precise moment with how the country, England itself, is feeling at this precise time. This massive amount of grief and sadness over a lost generation. Milne is an embodiment of a whole generation of men that went out to fight, and they either came back changed, like his illustrator friend E.L. Shepard, portrayed in the film by Stephen Campbell Moore, who himself fought at Passchendaele, or they didn't come back at all. Domhnall Gleeson himself, I think, delivers a very solid performance of a man who is slightly reserved in his own way, but he's haunted by what he's seen, and that certainly doesn't really help with his behaviour. I think that withdrawn nature of the character is very much that British stiff upper lip, and he's having trouble trying to reconcile that. And what the film argues is that when Milne finds solace in his creation, so too does England, and eventually the whole world manage to find at least some kind of peace in Winnie the Pooh. That fountain of joy that those books represented was something that the whole world needed at that precise moment in time. But A.A. isn't the only figure in this film that's depicted as having deep-seated emotional issues. The same can be said for his wife Daphne, played by Margot Robbie, who seems to display all the signs of postnatal depression. Christopher's birth is depicted on screen, and it seems to be a very tough and emotional process for her. Even before that point, A.A. and Daphne's relationship has been tested by the war, not just in his change of character upon his return, but also the fact that she has been at home waiting for him to come back, not knowing whether or not he will. And I think the fact that she gives birth to a son is something that she really didn't want. She wanted to give birth to a girl, and she openly admits the reason that because of that is because of the time that she spent waiting for AA to return. She senses that this isn't going to be the final war, that there is going to be another one, and that inevitably their son will become involved in that, and she didn't want that. She treats Christopher as if he were a girl and dresses him accordingly, and even his haircut is quite feminine, quite long. And I think that Margot Robbie is very much aware that the character she's portraying is one that audiences will likely find highly dislikable, but she doesn't shy away from that. In fact, she really attacks this part, warts and all. There is a certain fearlessness to Robbie's performance, and I think that she makes a really valiant attempt at trying to do a cut glass English accent in this movie, and I think that Robbie certainly shows that she really has some very strong dramatic chops here, and I think that both she and the movie try to present this character in a somewhat sympathetic way, because she's not a monster, she's a complicated figure, and I think that to some extent she is a product of her own time, in that she is this high society woman. She goes to these parties in London, and that is her world, and she's resentful at being torn away from that. And I think that she's also a product of this time where it's perfectly acceptable to have a baby and then leave the baby behind with the nanny and go back into this circle. And certainly I don't think she or AA really consider the sort of emotional abandonment or detachment that they're broadcasting to their offspring. She doesn't show a lot of emotion, she doesn't try to show any kind of vulnerability, because that's not how she's been raised. If she's thinking something, she will tell you it directly, no matter what. She doesn't sugarcoat it by any means, and sometimes she can be very cutting. But at the same time, when she does actually interact with Christopher, when she plays with his dolls and gives them voices and brings them to life, there is this warm motherly figure that does arise on occasion. That playful side of her does aid in the creation of, ultimately, Winnie the Pooh. But if there's anyone that has Christopher's best interest at heart, then it is his nanny, lovingly nicknamed Noo, played by Kelly MacDonald, who is absolutely wonderful in this part. She really radiates warmth, and I think that her role, she finds a sense of purpose in raising Christopher, in the fact that she has resigned herself to this fairly lonely life, but she's the one that forges the strongest emotional connection to Christopher in the view of his often absent parents, and she's the one that I think really raises him properly, and certainly I think is the one that looks out for him the most. And she portrays this role with a certain amount of quiet dignity, in that she's watching what's happening, and she has to bite her tongue sometimes. She has to keep her opinion of how the parents are treating him in check to a certain extent. And she has a genuine rapport with Will Tilston on screen, and Tilston is a real discovery for the film, because he has that youthful, innocent play that Christopher needs to embody as a character for those qualities that AA manages to rediscover in himself. And Tilston, I think, has a really great rapport with Gleeson on screen. The scenes where they're venturing out on their little adventures, playing around in Sherwood Forest, I think those scenes are really wonderfully played on screen, and I think it helps that Tilston is very natural on camera. He's not affected like a lot of child stars can be. The relationship between Christopher and AA, it's forged over a couple of weeks, really, where AA genuinely has to take care of Christopher due to circumstances, and as such really strikes up a connection in a way that I don't think he's managed to do previously. And in doing so, rediscovers something in himself that has maybe shut down since the war, and it gets him to look beyond that to a certain extent and manages to find a certain amount of inspiration and magic and whimsy, and that pure joy that he experiences over the course of those weeks is something that he manages to draw upon and place into his work. And because of the dynamic between Tilson and Gleeson, you completely believe it. There is a genuine sense of whimsy about what's happening on screen. And of course, the movie does that thing that a lot of movies about creation of works do, in that all the way through it's nodding to elements that will eventually become forged into the work. It's name-dropping elements about the 100-Acre Wood, or Piglet, or of course relating to the fact that Winnie refers to Winnipeg, which was a bear that was on display in London Zoo. All those elements are incorporated into the movie, and that relationship becomes pivotal to the way the film develops, because the movie moves past the point of creation. Unlike a lot of movies of this type, it doesn't conclude when the work is produced, because that's only half the story. The rest of it focuses on the effect it has on the family, especially Christopher. A reasons that because they call him Billy Moon, that there is enough of a separation from Christopher in real life, but really there isn't, because Christopher Robin is his son's real-life name, and because he uses so many real-life inspirations in the books, the line between fiction and reality is severely blurred, and Christopher suffers the effects of this because there are people and reporters coming to him and recognising, as Christopher Robin the book, he feels like he has to live up to his father's creation, how he's depicted in those works. But the people that recognise him don't really see the actual distinction between them. Suddenly he's thrust into this fame and stardom, and he's a young boy. It's far too much for him to cope with. And once A.A. has written the book, he reverts back to that somewhat aloof state, in that there is this abandonment of being a responsible parent for Christopher. Suddenly Christopher is engaging in all these competitions, he's meeting with interviews and politicians, and it becomes something that goes wildly out of control, and he doesn't help that. And some of the things that happen in this movie are crazy, but they actually happened. Christopher is asked by a photographer to go into a bear pit and sit alongside the bear for a staged photograph. That's madness, but it really did happen, and it just shows you the hysteria and unreality of celebrity, really. And what that creates is this huge feeling of resentment that builds up, not just because of the fact that he has this burden of being related to Winnie the Pooh his entire life, but also the responsibility that his parents had to him. They failed him to a certain extent, and the movie is surprisingly critical of A.A. Milne in its own way, and it doesn't really hold back from that. This movie goes into fairly dark avenues, and the film is really torn between these two different cross purposes, because it's on the one hand this golden-hued account of the creation of Winnie the Pooh, but it's also this tale of emotional neglect and depression and celebrity, and sometimes dealing with these two tones isn't exactly elegant, although I think the movie handles it about as well as it really could do, although it isn't helped sometimes by the editing of the movie. I think that, unusually for a film with this type, it's quite quickly cut, and especially when it's trying to depict the episodes that A.A. has where he's remembering the war, but sometimes it can feel quite abrupt within scenes. For example, there's a moment where Christopher is brought into a back room and it's filled with toys, and he's given one of them, but he throws a tantrum, so A.A. takes him aside, and there is this shot of them standing, and then it cuts to a close-up of A.A. and he's kneeling down, and we didn't see that movement. It's a weird jump cut, and I just found that very distracting at certain points in the movie. It kind of got in the way of the storytelling. But as the film moves into its later section, and as Christopher grows up, and he's played by Alex Lawther, who is very bitter towards his father, understandably so, there is this idea that despite AA's attempts, history is repeating itself, unfortunately, and that the world is heading towards war once again. And I do think that the movie handles all these ideas and themes, it brings them all up, and it's certainly something that, if you're a fan of the work, that you'll be particularly drawn to, but I don't think it entirely coalesces them in terms of the story, in that it brings up this idea that AA is meant to be a stand-in for England at the time, but the idea falls maybe into the background after London, and this idea of the inevitability of war happening once again dissipates until the film comes back to it in its final stretch. And I think as a film, it tells a very interesting story. There are certainly things about Winnie the Pooh that I discovered here that I didn't really know about before, but shaping that into a narrative, I don't think it wholly satisfied, but it makes up for that by being a quite well-made, quite well-acted piece of drama. And certainly, if you have an interest in this subject, I think it's going to be quite fascinating viewing overall. Goodbye, Christopher Robin is a bittersweet account of the creation of Winnie the Pooh and its surprisingly dark history. Domhnall Gleeson delivers a strong performance as a war-scarred A. Milne, learning to rediscover joy in the way that England needed at the time, while Margot Robbie adopts a surprisingly decent accent as Milne's difficult, somewhat unlikable wife. But it's Kelly MacDonald as the nanny who always has Robin's best interest that is the film's biggest asset. In his debut, Will Tilston is adorably natural as the eponymous figure, but the movie has to navigate between the whimsical charms of Milne's creation while also looking at the trauma of its writer and the toll it had on its family, which is sometimes an uneasy mix, not helped by jumpy editing. Nevertheless, it's an intriguing look at the creative process and fame, although you might not quite look at Pooh Bear the same way. If you like this review, then bounce on over to my Patreon where you can see my reviews early among other perks. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.
Where to?
Home, I should think.